Hey guys, welcome to my channel. I hope you're all doing very well. So I just watched episode 9 of Lovecraft Country. Let's talk about it. So this episode was definitely harrowing. As we've seen in the previous episodes, we did have a focus on a character and a historical event in Black American history. And in this case, I would say that the character that was focused on for this episode would be Montrose, as much as he possibly could be at this stage of the series. And the historical event that was highlighted is one that has been sprinkled throughout the series as of yet, but we really got a deep dive into the event specifically here, and that is of course the Tulsa Massacre of June 1920. Now this was one of the most, like I said, harrowing episodes of the series yet, purely because of the historical context that was explored here, but there was also a lot to unpack in terms of the plot, because we are now at the penultimate episode of this series and perhaps even the show overall, and so we definitely had a lot of ground to cover before we entered the finale. There's definitely a lot to unravel for this video, but I will say going in, whilst in the previous recaps that I've done for this show, I haven't really talked about my thoughts on the episode specifically, or if I have, it's been very brief, because I want to focus on providing a review for you guys once we've seen the whole of the show, as opposed to focusing specifically on reviewing each episode. So that's why I do recaps of the episodes and then focus on reviewing the series as a whole once it's done. But I have to say, I do have a few thoughts about this episode specifically that we'll be going into, and it will go into review territory for this video. But before we dive into any of that, just a friendly reminder that if you haven't already, please be sure to subscribe to my channel and turn on your notifications so that you can be told when I upload next, and be sure to share your thoughts on this episode of Lovecraft Country down in the comments below. I would very much love to hear your thoughts on this episode, especially for this one, because I have a lot of mixed feelings on it, and I'm going to be diving into my thoughts and feelings on the episode in this video, but if you would like to add anything, be sure to do so in the comments. Okay, without further ado, let's dive into this. So like I said, I do have mixed feelings about episode 9 of Lovecraft Country. There are some things that I very much enjoyed and very much was in awe of the show for being able to explore and dive into in such an artistic and beautiful way, but then there are other things that I'm a little bit concerned about and a little bit disappointed by. So in order to kind of fully analyze both aspects of this, we're going to split this kind of recap, kind of review into two parts. First of all, we're going to explore specifically the historical context that is explored in this episode, that of course being the Tulsa Massacre. Then we're going to dive into some of the plot points specifically, because I feel like that's where a lot of the issues come. So like I said before, this episode focuses on the Tulsa Massacre of 1921, an event that was very much overshadowed in history until at least last year, where we saw it be brilliantly explored in HBO's Watchmen series. That episode on the Tulsa Massacre was incredible. That was the episode that really set this show apart from all other superhero comic book shows. I mean, it was just genius. It was also incredibly informative because a lot of people didn't know about this event in history, and after seeing the show, we were able to research this event and find out more about the cruelty that was involved here, and at the same time we were able to dig deeper and find out about more events that happened just like this one. So here we have a case where in the early 20th century, Tulsa, which had this flourishing, prosperous Black community to the point where it was even referred to as Black Wall Street, which ended up being attacked, vandalized, brutalized by white protesters to the point where the whole community was utterly destroyed. Many people died. The number of people that specifically died has been contested, but for a long time it was downplayed to about 30, but people have been finding more evidence to suggest that many more people died and many more people were injured in these attacks. But it was a massacre. It was a horrendous event in history that was propelled by racism, that was propelled by hatred on the part of the white community in that area. If we wanted to, we could compare the depiction of the Tulsa Massacre between the one that we saw in Watchmen versus the one that we saw in this episode of Lovecraft Country. We don't have to, because I don't see a problem with there being more than one depiction of this horrific event in history. We already have such a plethora of World War I, World War II, and Vietnam movies, for example, so there's really no issue with there being more than one instance where this event in history has been depicted. But if we were to compare the two, I would say that in my opinion, opinion, Watchmen did a better job of really throwing you into the event itself, throwing you into the violence, the confusion, the horror, the terror of that event, because when we're introduced to this setup, we're in it, we're in the thick of it already. And so in many ways, that Watchmen episode felt so much more emotionally impactful and so visceral, especially because that's how they open up the show. So we're given no wider context whatsoever, but we're just thrown into this violent event. Whereas when it comes to Lovecraft Country, because this is a magical, mystical show, it does have some of those elements intertwined in this historical event, and as a result, some of the focus is lost on the massacre itself, because we're on this essentially a magical heist that takes place in history, because the main characters want to find the Book of Names, and so there is a bit of a distraction there when it comes to focusing specifically on the event. But I will still say that they did depict the violence of the event very, very well. I mean, it was still heartbreaking, it was still gut-wrenching. It's just that there was a little bit of focus on Leti and finding the book. In the case of Watchmen, like I said, the violence and the brutality of the massacre itself was the main focus. There was nothing else in that episode to really distract you from what was happening at that moment in time. However, I will say that in Lovecraft Country, there's a bit more of an exploration of Tulsa as a community beforehand. So it gives you a better sense of just how prosperous and successful this Black community was, and how they were really thriving in this neighborhood, which makes it all the more horrifying, all the more upsetting when we see it go up in flames. But overall, when it comes to the depictions of the Tulsa massacre that we have gotten in the last year or so, I have so much respect for the Watchmen team and the Lovecraft Country team for choosing to depict this horrific event that was lost in history. So I had no issues with the depiction of this event in this episode. In fact, I thought that was the best part of the episode. The issues that I have stem from the plot of this series specifically, and how it's developed in this episode, and how, even though this is the penultimate episode of the show, I feel like so many questions have been left unanswered, and I'm really, really worried. I'm really, really scared for the finale of this series. So first off, episode 9 picks up where episode 8 left off. We see Dee has been infected or hexed and cursed by those 2 demon spirits that she was followed by in the previous episode. First of all, can I just say, I would have very much appreciated it if we didn't get their reappearance in this episode. Like, I remember what they look like. You don't have to show me again. Please stop making them pop up. It's horrifying. It's traumatic. Please stop. I hope we don't get another appearance from them in episode 10, because at that point it's just gratuitous. Please stop it. Anyways, due to Montrose's unwanted intervention, these demons managed to curse Dee, and now the adults are trying to figure out how they can finally help this child who they left unsupervised under their care. So silly, so irresponsible. This all could have been prevented if they just paid attention to her, but we already discussed this in the previous review. So they're all trying to point fingers at each other, trying to figure out who's to blame, but as Ruby makes clear, they are all to blame. And in fact, she can include herself in that as well, because Hippolyta specifically left her child under her care. Instead, she was elsewhere, otherwise occupied. But the gang soon concludes that they have to turn to Christina to find a solution for this, and Tick suggests offering up Titus's pages, the ones that they almost died to get, the ones that Montrose literally killed someone in order to protect, whatever. He offers up the pages, not knowing that, of course, Leti already offered up those pages in exchange for invulnerability for her and her unborn child. And so Tick finds this out and he gets really annoyed. Montrose gets even more upset because now he sees just how dire the situation is, and I'm just rolling my eyes over here thinking, why can't these people communicate? Why is no one talking to each other? I've at this point I have gotten so frustrated. Let me calm down. I have gotten so frustrated with Tick and Leti at this point. This is episode 9. This is episode 9 and we're still not talking. We're still not communicating about the positions that we're at, even though we keep insisting that we want to protect one another, even though we've seen the effects of secrecy and what happened to Dee and the fact that she was left out of the loop and that left her vulnerable. Even though we've seen all of this, we're continuing to keep secrets. My God, it's just frustrating. It's just so frustrating. I hate that about this couple. Because it's revealed that Leti already offered Christina the pages, they have to figure out another way to get Christina on board. And then Ruby raises her hand and says, I think we'll be good. I think we'll be good on that front because I have connections and everyone's looking at her like, what do you mean she's gonna come for you? What does that mean exactly? Although Leti already knows the deal, but it's definitely a revelation for the rest of the gang that Ruby has been in on this in more ways than one. And if we had a bit more time, I would have liked to see a scene where everyone just sits down and talks about their position in this whole situation and reveals everything that they need to reveal, all the secrets, the lies. They just say it outright so that we can move past this and we can create a stronger team that can go up against Christina, who's so ahead at this point. But because this is the penultimate episode, things are moving very quickly. So Christina comes around no problem. She offers up her services in exchange for Tick coming to her voluntarily back to Arden so that she can perform that witchy ceremony where she will become immortal. And she needs every single drop of Tick's blood in order for this spell to work. And so as I predicted last week, that is why she refused to give him invulnerability, because she knows that she's going to need him to be quite vulnerable in order to die so that the spell could work. Now, like I already said, I very much take issue with the fact that the gang have basically handed Christina her victory to her. Like, I wish we had seen Christina actually try to get what she needed for this spell to work, but instead people are making stupid decisions based on the fact that they're keeping secrets, and she's just benefited from their stupidity. And on this point, whilst we're already here, I'm also not the biggest fan of Leti's pregnancy. I feel like at first it was just a development in the character and in the relationship between Leti and Tick, but now it's just become so all-consuming to their decision-making process. Like, they're making the dumbest decisions in the name of protecting this unborn child, when in reality they were already trying to protect themselves from Christina. That's the whole point of them risking their lives to get Titus's pages in that crazy booby-trapped tomb in the first place. So why would they then just hand over the protection that they just gotten for themselves in the name of protecting their child? That makes no sense. You were literally on your way to protecting. In this sense, they're just prolonging the danger, because Leti tried to negotiate with Christina in order to get Tick invulnerability so that he wouldn't be harmed. But the whole point of them getting those pages was that Tick would be able to use the magic, use the spells in order to protect them all. So how was it beneficial? How is it beneficial to give Christina the advantage? Because even if Tick is invulnerable, everyone else could die. I don't understand the thinking. I don't understand the reasoning behind any of their decisions. And it seems to be that the show keeps telling me, oh, it's because Leti's pregnant. Like, she's pregnant, they're expecting a child, and therefore this makes sense. But it actually doesn't. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense. So back to Dee and her curse, Christina does agree to help out in exchange for Tick going willingly back to Arden, but she also makes it clear that there's not much she can do other than renew the spell so that it could give them a bit more time for a more permanent solution, because the only person who could actually reverse this spell or break it entirely would be Captain Lancaster, the caster of the spell itself. Now, this was very interesting because later on it's revealed that Captain Lancaster is dying. He is dying from the bullet wounds and the wounds that he suffered again in the previous episode where we saw Tick's new puppy go ham on him. So he's actually dying from those wounds, even though he should be healing because he also works with magic and he's also wearing that black torso that we saw. But because of the little artifacts that Ruby planted in his office per Christina's request, he's forced to relive the injuries that he suffered previously, preventing him from healing. Now, in this scene, we also get a confirmation that he is in fact wearing a black man's torso, and it is connected to that white scientist from episode 3. I can't remember his name, but his experimentations on black people and how he was connected to Captain Lancaster, who no doubt provided him with bodies to experiment on. And in return, I'm guessing the scientist provided Captain Lancaster with a fit black body to wear as clothing on his torso. And so here we're seeing, you know, black bodies being utilized for literally just their physicality. This was something that was also touched on in Get Out, where the girlfriend's brother mentions, like, man, with your physique you could do so much. This idea that, you know, black bodies are used for sports, for physical activities, but at the same time the intellect of black people and their contributions elsewhere aren't recognized. All of this is to say that Christina could have used Captain Lancaster's situation as leverage if she actually cared. She could have told Captain Lancaster caster to reverse the spell on Dee so that she would provide him with a spell reversal of her own, and therefore he would be able to survive with his black body. Like, that's what she could have negotiated if she actually gave a crap. But she doesn't. She doesn't actually care. She's in it for herself. Like she says earlier to Ruby, she has this whole plan that has been meticulously laid out, and she's not going to diverge from that plan, even if it is to save a young black child who's apparently gifted because of her detailed work on those pages. She doesn't care. At the end of the day, she wants revenge for William, and she wants her plan for immortality to work out. That's literally all she cares about. So Christina tells the gang that in order for her to temporarily reverse the effects of the hex, she needs the blood of Dee's closest family member. And so that's where we get the scene between Montrose and Tick, where Montrose finally reveals that actually Atticus might be George's son. Now, this was a very impactful, heartbreaking scene, and it was actually a very impactful theme throughout this episode, because this is something that ruminates on Tick's mind throughout the episode, even when they travel back in time. It's just such a huge revelation, and of course it should be, because this is a man who abused him throughout his whole childhood, even into adulthood, to the point where he felt the need to sign up to go to war in Korea. Like, he wanted to get away from his father so much that he went into war voluntarily. And now Montrose is telling him that he's not even his father, that he potentially didn't even need to go through any of this, that all this time that Tick had been wishing that George was his father, that this lovely uncle of his that he had so much more in common with would be his father. It turns out that potentially he was all along. And not only that, but he was finding out about this after George is already dead. I mean, this whole storyline was just so complex, so gut-wrenching, and both of the actors, Jonathan Majors and Michael K. Williams, they acted the hell out of this whole story. Like, they were actoring. That's what they were doing. Absolutely, they did an incredible job, because the complex emotions between these two characters were conveyed beautifully, especially Jonathan Majors. I felt Tick's heartbreak. I felt Tick's anger and frustration. Oh, it was absolutely wonderful, and I think it's one of the few plot lines that were kind of wrapped up in this episode that was done justice, like, absolutely. But another plot line that I would say was somewhat let down would be Hippolyta returning from her journey of self-discovery. She pops up out of the blue, no pun intended, and she is conveniently there so that she can provide her blood for Christina's spell. Now, I don't have many qualms on this. I just wish that they had more time to really ruminate on the fact that she traveled through time, space, the multiverse. Like, it's such a huge deal, and everyone just kind of brushes it off and moves on. And I get it, because it's a high stakes situation where Dee is in trouble, but at the same time, it's a huge deal. Like, how did she even come back? The machine's broken. How did she come back? Because they needed to fix the machine before they could go back in time. So how did she return in the first place? Like, all of these questions are buzzing around in that scene, but they're kind of being ignored in favor of focusing on this main storyline. Although, and what's a common theme in this show, whilst the scene does feel a little bit rushed and it doesn't feel like the storyline gets its due, the actors do such a good job in the moment that you're convinced that we do need to move forward and there is more to explore. Because the actress who portrays Hippolyta, I can't remember her name right now, but the way that she was talking about how she's traveled through the space-time continuum, she's seen so much, she's gained so much knowledge, and right now what she knows is that she needs to save her daughter immediately. That was an effective little speech. Like, I have to give her credit for that. So the gang figure out that if there's one way that Dee could permanently be freed from this hex, it would be to get the Book of Names itself, and therefore they would have to travel back in time into 1921, where it was last seen, at Tick's mum's house, and steal it, basically. Like I said, this is a time traveling heist situation, but my biggest issue with this plotline that was explored in this episode is that it feels very stop and starty. The whole premise of this episode is that Dee needs to be saved. There is a time limit, because Christina was only able to hold back the time that this hex would take place only by so much. They needed to hurry up and find a more permanent solution, so the time was of the essence here. But at some point it felt like we were taking a leisurely stroll. At some points it felt like we were just hanging out in 1921 for shits and giggles. We have a mission. We have a mission, and yet not everyone is on board. We have a mission, and yet people are distracted from it. Now, I completely understand that Montrose was traumatized by having to go back to 1921 Tulsa just mere hours before the massacre took place. I completely understand that he was dealing with PTSD. I completely understand that it is unnatural for him to have had to go back in order to experience this whole horrible event again. However, we're trying to save a child's life. death. We literally see her mother become a motherboard, a piece of machinery in order to conduct electricity, in order for that machine to work. We literally see Hippolyta give her all. At the very end, she's frothing at the mouth. She is vomiting. She is giving every single electron in her body to save her child. And as she should, because her child is in danger. She probably feels very guilty for leaving her child behind, as we discussed in my review of episodes 6 or 7, where we explored the fact that she is a mother, but she chose to stay behind instead of go back to her daughter. But everyone else in this gang is just so leisurely about this whole mission that it literally drove me crazy. Montrose's sole contribution to this whole mission is literally guiding them to Tick's mother's family home, and at that point he just kind of wanders off. And I get it. He's walking down memory lane, he's reliving a ton of emotions that he probably hasn't even fully processed. I understand, but in terms of the plot, like, it's time is of the essence. And yet everyone seems to be so distracted by everything other than the fact that Dee is dying or becoming a demon. But still, it was very important to see Montrose's roots and to really understand where he's coming from, to perhaps be able to empathize with him a bit more. It still doesn't make up for him killing Yahima though, but I guess that's what the show is trying to do. We also saw what George meant when he said earlier on in this season that Montrose would often be beat on more often, and he would just kind of look ahead and let it happen, because that's exactly what happens. He literally stands there whilst his brother has been beaten bloody and does nothing, which angered me even more, because moments after this happened, Leti and Tick go off to chase after Montrose. But they have this scene where Tick is able to get this old-fashioned car, and just before she jumps on it, Leti is like, well, I guess we'll name him George, like acknowledging the fact that she's pregnant. And it's supposed to be this like cute little moment that they have between each other, except why would she say that right after she's seen George do absolutely nothing to save Montrose? That made no sense. That made no sense. Literally after she's seen George do nothing whilst his brother was beaten bloody, she decided to name her son after him. What? And of course, later on, Montrose does clarify that George did help him in so many ways as a brother. But in that moment, after you've seen him be such a terrible brother, I don't know if your first thought would be, I'm gonna name my son after him. It made no sense. But the stopping and starting would definitely be my main criticism when it came to that whole heist. I think the reimagining of Tulsa in 1921 was absolutely stunning, absolutely beautiful. I mean, this show at this point, it knows what it's doing when it comes to set design. It knows what it's doing when it comes to costuming, okay? So it looked absolutely marvelous, and it really did emphasize how much was lost after the massacre. The writing of this episode itself felt like it was fighting between propelling the plot forward, but also exploring the Tulsa massacre as a historical event in Black history. It was kind of fighting amongst those two, which is why there were a lot of moments where Leti was standing around, you know, talking to Tick's mum's family, even though time was of the essence and she needed to get out of there as soon as possible, because Hippolyta literally was frothing at the mouth, like I said. And also there was that moment when Montrose was saying this whole soliloquy about all of these people that died in Tulsa, these accomplished Black people who were attacked, whose homes and businesses were destroyed. He kind of has this whole soliloquy about that, and it's very powerful, it's very moving, but it also makes no sense plot-wise, because he's standing mere centimeters away from the actual portal that Hippolyta, again, is frothing at the mouth to keep open. I firmly believe that he should have hopped through that portal first of all, so that Hippolyta would know that he was back, and then he could watch as Tulsa burned through the portal and say his soliloquy then. And we also have that scene where Leti is walking through fire with the book in her arms. It's a very Daenerys Targaryen moment. I see what you did there, HBO. But at the same time, it still makes no sense. She should be running. She should be running. I think I've made my point on this one. So I'll no longer belabor the point. But let's go back in time in this episode where we saw Christina and Ruby have their interaction. So after Christina performs the spell on Dee, we see her leave and we see Ruby chasing after her. And afterwards, Ruby does confront Christina about the lies that she has told her and about the deceit surrounding their whole complicated relationship. And Christina is very upfront and honest with her. She very clearly states that she does have goals, she does have ulterior motives, but she never really specifically lied to Ruby. And in fact, she did come to help Dee for Ruby. It just so happens that she saw an opportunity to gain something herself and she took it, which is very manipulative. I mean, fine, even though she didn't technically lie, she's still being deceptive. She's still not telling the whole truth. Although if there is any character that Christina has been the most forthcoming with the truth with, I guess it would be Ruby at this point. But it's in this conversation that we finally get somewhat of an explanation for why Christina is doing all of this stuff. Now, I've been mentioning in my reviews that I did notice that Christina keeps saying the phrase, "this is my first time." I just keep editing it out because I didn't feel like it was an important point to make, but I guess it is, because that is essentially her motivation for what she's doing here. She wants to achieve immortality so that she can have an eternity of firsts. I was so confused. I was so confused and dismayed. I was like, really? This is your motivation? At least with one half of her plan, she wanted to get revenge for William. But this whole eternity of first thing makes very little sense, especially because we haven't really got much of a backstory on Christina to begin with. I'm not a fan of this motivation for the character. It just seems so throwaway. It seems so much of an afterthought, especially for someone who's as intelligent as Christina has been presented. But if that wasn't enough to confuse me and give this episode a little bit of a side eye, we then had Ruby committing homicide. She literally kills Dell. She turns off the machine that is keeping Dell, the white woman whose body she often wears, alive. Now, this is confusing for two reasons. First of all, I thought that Ruby's whole arc was that she no longer felt the need to be a white woman in order to be satisfied with her life and satisfied with herself. I thought she had developed a greater sense of self by the end of episode 5, after she'd gone through those 5 stages of metamorphosis. So I'm confused as to why she's still utilizing this white body. It feels like she's been doing this off screen often, and she's decided that actually she wanted to be a redhead all along. And Christina kind of gives her this evil smile, like, yeah, that's my girl. Listen, which brings me to the second point of why I was really confused, because why is Ruby straight up killing someone? Why is Ruby straight up killing someone? When did we get to the point where she literally just kills people? Did I miss that episode? So I guess Ruby is just fully evil now. I don't know. I mean, she has no regard for Tick. That much is sure. So perhaps she has no regard for human life in general. I guess that's Christina's impact on her. So that's it from me. Now that I told you guys my thoughts on episode 9 of Lovecraft Country, it's time for you guys to let me know what you thought of this episode down in the comments below. Please be sure to subscribe to catch new videos coming up. Thank you guys so much for watching. I really appreciate it, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.